Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fly Girls Revolt, the story of the women who kicked open the door to flying combat, by Eileen Bjorkman, narrated by Lisa S. Ware. Introduction. As the sun rose one spring day in 2003, I chatted over coffee with 4 other Air Force colonels in an office near the Pentagon. I was the only woman. We worked in an organization that analyzed combat scenarios for Air Force leadership, and our weekly Friday meeting was our chance to talk freely and blow off steam amongst ourselves without the presence of superiors or subordinates. 3 weeks before that Friday, the United States had invaded Iraq, and our conversation turned to the fight. One of the colonels summarized an incident he'd read in a report. 2 A-10s got attacked a few days ago, and one of them got really shot up. The flight lead told the pilot she could eject if she wanted to, but she chose to fly it back. It took her an hour, but she made it back to her base and landed. The 5 of us nodded and murmured appreciatively at what was apparently an exceptional bit of airmanship. Then, as aviators do, we speculated about what had happened. Had she been hit by a missile or anti-aircraft artillery? At what altitude? What parts of her aircraft were damaged? I was secretly thrilled that no one commented on the pilot's gender. Perhaps the other colonels, 3 of whom had flown fighters, didn't say anything because of my presence. But they clearly weren't surprised a woman had performed admirably in combat. This scene would have been impossible when I began my Air Force career in 1980. At that time, women were not allowed to fly in combat. A law passed by Congress in 1948 prohibited that. The law was repealed in 1991, but even that historic moment didn't immediately open combat aircraft to women. The march to equality was not steady. It was more like a game where the women started 10 points behind, and every time they clawed their way forward, the opposing team ran back over them. Until the end of World War II, only female nurses were permanent members of the U.S. military. Women brought in for emergency service during World War I were quickly discharged at the war's end. Those who served during World War II expected the same fate. Senior military leadership in Congress stepped in to make women a small, but permanent, part of each service. But for the next 2 decades, those small organizations were subject to the whims of political and military leadership. Support for military women waxed and waned. On more than one occasion, the Air Force tried to get rid of them altogether. The few women who did serve suffered discrimination in promotions and pay for dependents, limited career fields, sexual harassment, and automatic discharges for pregnancy. In the 1970s, spurred by successful lawsuits, the Equal Rights Amendment, and abolishment of the draft, military women began making permanent gains. The services slowly opened more career fields to women, including those of pilot and navigator. But the combat exclusion laws stymied women's careers. The women aviators were allowed to fly support aircraft such as aerial refueling tankers, but only men were allowed to shoot enemy aircraft out of the sky or drop bombs. Men had a chance to be on the varsity team, while women were relegated to the junior varsity, even though many of them were as good as or better than the men. By the late 1980s, women aviators were tired of not being able to contribute to the best of their abilities. They wanted a chance to compete on a level playing field. But the desire wasn't just about being woke in the name of equality. Allowing women into combat aircraft would also ensure that commanders got the best aviator for a particular job, Not just the male aviator who was selected because the woman better than him had to go fly a cargo aircraft instead. The combat exclusion laws, designed with the World War II style warfare of total surrender in mind, also didn't work as intended. In the 1980s, women aviators repeatedly flew during short, high-intensity armed conflicts with limited objectives, entering hostile areas to deliver cargo and troops, refuel airplanes, evacuate wounded personnel, direct air battles, and listen in on enemy communications. Commanders soon realized that it was impossible to keep women away from hostile forces during modern combat, and women did everything men did except for shoot back at the enemy. But a woman's ability to fly into a hostile area often had little to do with her capabilities. Instead, individual commanders withheld women from operations deemed too dangerous, while other commanders sent whoever was on the schedule with no thought to gender at all. The 1990 to 1991 Persian Gulf War changed everything. The nightly news made it clear that the military needed women to function. The public also realized that women were in combat. U.S. citizens were proud of the women's accomplishments, not horrified that they were at war and that some of them died. After the dust settled from the conflict, women aviators and their supporters pushed to overturn the laws. The opposition put up a fierce fight. Some even continued to advocate for removing women from the military altogether. The laws were overturned within months, but a presidential commission to study the issue of women in combat allowed the services to delay the introduction of women into combat aircraft for nearly another 2 years. The women aviators, consummate professionals, continued to do their jobs until the doors finally opened in April 1993. There are household names in this story, such as Senators Edward Kennedy and John McCain, and Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder. There are also names well known in aviation circles, such as Jacqueline Cochran. But most of the women who kicked open the door to flying combat are not famous. Many were not aviators. Some weren't even in the military. Some were vocal about the need for change. Others just did their jobs, proving they belonged on the team. The vast majority of the women aviators in this story would never fly in combat. By the time the laws and policies changed, they were too old to switch careers. But they proved they belonged and fought to get rid of archaic rules that stifled their own dreams, so women after them would have equal opportunities and military commanders would have the best people for the job. Younger women aviators who have flown in combat have published many memoirs. Likewise, there are many books about a group of women who flew as civilian pilots during World War II. But there are few books about the women military aviators of my generation. These women, who began their service in the 1970s and 1980s, made the final push to open the door to fly in combat. This is our story. Chapter 1. We Need Women. We Don't Need Women. 1940s. Jacqueline Cochran waited impatiently in her New York City apartment while a group of men in Canada debated her fate. It was June 1941, and she hoped to ferry an American bomber aircraft across the Atlantic and deliver it to the Royal Air Force. The blonde aviatrix, considered the queen of aviation in the United States, was renowned for daredevil, record-breaking flights and her cosmetics business, activities that might seem incompatible. But Cochran, who believed that women were just as good at flying airplanes as men, also believed it was a woman's duty to be as presentable as her circumstances of time and purse permit. Her own time available might only be a few minutes to comb her hair and daub on fresh lipstick at the end of an 11-hour flight, but Cochrane always appeared before the cameras looking as if she had just stepped out of a beauty salon. Except for her fingernails. She never wore polish to avoid attracting attention to her masculine-appearing hands. Cochrane had done everything possible to prepare for the transatlantic flight. She had no experience flying heavy, multi-engine aircraft like the bomber. She had accomplished her aviation feats over the past decade in small, nimble racers. So she'd headed to Floyd Bennett Field on Long Island for several hours of instruction in a Lockheed Lodestar. She then flew to St. Hubert Airport, about 45 minutes from Montreal, home to the Atlantic Ferry Organization, or ATFERO. There she trained on the bomber she planned to ferry, a Lockheed Hudson. She passed all her check rides, or practical tests, although she had some trouble grasping a handbrake used on the ground. Given her difficulty with the brake, ATFERO officials decided she would fly the bomber as a first officer. She could take the controls once airborne, but the other, male pilot, would take off and land. Cochrane wasn't happy, but there was nothing she could do. Many ATFERO pilots opposed the flight. About 50 of them formed a band of objectors and called a meeting to discuss the problem. Cochrane's husband, Floyd Odlum, attended to plead her case while she returned to New York. "She's on a publicity stunt," said one pilot. It was true that Cochrane had leaped at the chance to be the first woman to fly a bomber across the Atlantic, but it wasn't her idea. She had been at a luncheon with Clayton Knight, a World War I aviator who dabbled in all sorts of aviation-related activities, such as illustrating the Ace Drummond comic strip written by World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker. Knight was recruiting U.S. pilots for ATFERO. During the luncheon, he asked Cochrane, "Why don't you do some of this flying to England yourself to help dramatize the need? The publicity might help." As Odlum dismissed the publicity concerns, another pilot said, "She'll belittle the rest of us who have been involved in this dangerous work. This isn't woman's work, it's for men." This opinion was really a fear that if a woman could do the job, it wasn't all that dangerous. There was a small possibility the Germans might try to shoot down Cochrane, but that was a risk she was willing to take. Yet another pilot hit the bottom line. Putting a woman into the cockpit of a bomber for ferrying purposes is taking the bread out of our own mouths. But Cochrane was flying one flight, not storming ATFERO with a phalanx of women pilots. The last pilot to speak told Floyd, "Taking a woman into our organization will be disruptive. We've disapproved of your wife being here from the very moment the question was raised. We've simply been overruled by higher-ups." But he conceded, "We're not running this organization, and we've no right to issue an ultimatum to anyone, not even Miss Cochrane." The last pilot was right. The higher-ups had spoken, and it was time to follow orders. Captain Grafton Carlyle was assigned to fly with Cochrane. He was mad, not at Cochrane, but at the other men, some of whom threatened to blackball him from flying jobs for taking the assignment. Cochrane arrived back in Canada on June 16, 1941. Carlyle was eager to get going. The next morning, as the two pilots and a radio officer made their final preparations, the wives of the two men arrived, ostensibly to bring sandwiches. But the women weren't worried about their husbands' stomachs. They were concerned about the threats made against them. The wives waited in their cars until the bomber took off. The first leg of the trip to Gander, Newfoundland was uneventful, but the next morning, the ground roll during the takeoff run was so bumpy it felt like rolling over logs on the runway. Carlyle aborted the takeoff. Suspecting that cold had affected the oleo struts that acted as shock absorbers, he taxied back to the ramp. The crew serviced the struts and offloaded about 600 pounds of fuel for good measure. The takeoff was rough, but Carlyle managed to stagger into the air. With the aircraft safely airborne, Carlyle climbed out of the pilot's seat, and Cochrane slid in to take the controls. Carlyle headed to the back of the plane to pass time until a few minutes before landing, when he and Cochrane would again perform the change of control dance. Everyone settled in for the 11-hour flight, mostly above and in the clouds. Cochrane saw the aurora borealis for the first time. She found it weird but entrancing. Just before daybreak, tracer bullets streaked toward them, breaking the monotony. Carlyle and the radio operator dashed into the cockpit. The crew didn't know if the bullets were British or German, but there was a way to find out. Carlyle grabbed a signal pistol and ran to the back of the aircraft. He popped open a hatch and fired a signal bullet of a color that indicated they were a friendly aircraft. The bullets from the ground continued, and Cochrane worried that maybe the Germans were trying to kill her. But perhaps the cloud cover prevented anyone below from seeing the signal from the Hudson. The bullets suddenly stopped. When they landed, they found no damage to the bomber. Cochrane never learned who fired at them. For another half-century, women aviators would hear the same arguments the male pilots made in their battle to keep Cochrane out of the bomber. They were just in it for glamour. Combat flying was too dangerous, and they took jobs from men. Most of all, women were disruptive. 4 decades after her death, Jacqueline Cochrane remains an enigma. One of her biographers, Marianne Bucknam Brindley, summed her up as an explosive study in contradictions. Simultaneously generous, egotistical, penny-pinching, compassionate, sensitive, and aggressive. Cochrane's 2 autobiographies contain so much demonstrably false material that it's difficult to know when she was telling the truth. Cochrane claimed to not know when she was born or who her parents were, but she was born in 1906 in Florida's Panhandle. Her birth name was Bessie Lee Pittman. She was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. As an adult, she told people she was adopted and wove vivid stories of a childhood filled with gut-wrenching poverty. Another oft-repeated story had her picking the name Cochrane out of a telephone book in Pensacola, but none of it was true. The truth was that around 1920, Bessie Pittman married Robert Cochrane. They had a son, also Robert, who died in 1925 after setting himself on fire while playing with matches. The Cochranes divorced soon afterwards. Bessie moved to Montgomery, Alabama to work as a hairdresser and began using the name Jacqueline. As she moved further north, she buried her past along with her son. She never mentioned her first marriage or dead son again, at least in public. And she never had another child. Cochrane arrived in New York City in 1929 and landed a position at a salon in Saks Fifth Avenue. She met Floyd Odlum in 1932 and the two began dating, even though he was still married and had 2 sons. Odlum was one of the world's most wealthy men. He had founded his own company in the 1920s and thrived during the Depression by snapping up depressed companies and then selling them quickly at a profit, usually 40 or 50%. The two made for an odd couple. Odlum, far from a looker with his horn-rimmed glasses, next to the glamorous Cochrane. She claimed she loved him for his mind, and she justified their dating by saying the marriage was over. The divorce just hadn't happened yet. Odlum sparked Cochrane's interest in aviation. She wanted to sell cosmetics on the road, to cover enough territory to make money. He suggested she should fly. Why not get a pilot's license and fly herself? Cochrane liked the idea. The Roosevelt Aviation School on Long Island advertised 20 hours of flight training for $495. Cochrane was in a hurry, and Odlum bet her the $495 that she couldn't get her license in 6 weeks. It was just the sort of challenge she needed. Cochrane started her training on a Saturday and claimed she soloed in a little airplane called a Fleet 2 days later. During her first solo flight, which involved taking off and landing a few times, the engine quit. Some students would have panicked, but Cochran handled the emergency with aplomb. She glided back to the runway and touched down as if nothing had gone wrong. 3 weeks later, she had her license and Odlum paid up. By 1934, Cochran had earned her commercial pilot's license, meaning she could be paid for her flying. She was also learning how to fly just by looking at instruments inside the cockpit so she could fly in poor weather. By then, she wanted to do more than sell cosmetics. She wanted to enter airplane races. The races, common in the 1930s, garnered front-page coverage in newspapers, and winners often became famous. Cochran's first race attempt, an international route from England to Australia, ended in Bucharest, Romania after she realized her aircraft, a GB, wasn't suited to such a long distance. In 1935, she founded Jacqueline Cochran Cosmetics. Her signature product was Flowing Velvet, a moisturizer she developed to cure her skin problems created by flying, especially at high altitudes. That year, Cochran also set a new target for her racing ambitions. The most prestigious aviation event in the U.S., the Bendix Trophy Race, a transcontinental race founded in 1931 that took place each Labor Day weekend. The National Air Race Committee and Vincent Bendix, who manufactured innovative aircraft parts, each provided half of a $15,000 purse. Cliff Henderson, founder of the National Air Races, hoped the cash prizes would entice entrants to push the technology bounds of navigation, weather, efficiency, endurance, and speed. In 1934, Henderson had barred women from the race, saying, "Women have no more place in the national air races than on the automobile racetrack at Indianapolis." He didn't have anything against women aviators, of course. But a year earlier, 23-year-old Florence Klingensmith had died when a wing fell off her aircraft during a tight pylon turn at a race in Chicago. Male pilots died just about every year during the races, but Henderson apparently couldn't stomach the thought of a woman's death. After Frances Harrell Marsalis died in a crash at the first Women's National Air Meet in August 1934, a writer lamented in Popular Aviation magazine, "Just one more victim of the race mania and a desire to feed death-defying thrills to a hungry public." Without any discussion on why he considered a female pilot's death more tragic than a man's, he asked, "Is it worth the price?" Women pilots thought it was. They railed against Henderson's injunction. Amelia Earhart, the most famous of them all, refused to fly actress Mary Pickford from Los Angeles to Cleveland, where Pickford was scheduled to open the races. Famed aviator Jimmy Doolittle flew Pickford instead. Henderson relented the next year, and both Earhart and Cochran started the race in Burbank. On August 31st, 1935, Amelia Earhart roared down the runway at 12:34 a.m., with 2 male pilots playing cards in the back of her Lockheed Vega. The trio wasn't interested in winning. They just hoped to come in 5th place to earn $500 to cover their trip expenses. They got their wish. Fog rolled in after Earhart's takeoff, so Cochran bided time, finally lifting off at 4:22 a.m. A fence at the end of the runway snagged an antenna, leaving her with no radio. After circling her fuel-laden aircraft to gain altitude, she crossed the San Bernardino Mountains. She was in the race. But the climb had strained her engine, and an ominous vibration rattled her aircraft's tail. As Cochran approached the Grand Canyon at daylight, she knew there were no more airports for hundreds of miles to land in an emergency. Worse, thunderstorms lay ahead. Cochran was bold, but she knew her limits. The race was over for her. She turned around and landed at a nearby airport. The next year, 1936, the women shone. Louise Thaden became the first woman to win the Bendix race, and women took 3 of the 5 prizes. Cochrane didn't race, but that year she and Floyd Odlum married. The 1937 race was a sad time. Earhart had vanished 2 months earlier during her round-the-globe flight, leaving a giant void in women's aviation. Despite her heavy heart, Cochrane placed third. By then she had honed her long-distance flying skills. To keep her mouth moist, she sipped on a small bottle half filled with cola. A full bottle fizzed and spilled at high altitudes. Except for a handful of suckers, she didn't eat during a flight and could lose as much as 6 pounds. After a race, she smiled in front of microphones, grateful that reporters stood too far away to detect the deep lines of fatigue in her face. In 1938, flying a modified Seversky pursuit aircraft designed for the military, Cochrane departed Burbank about 2 a.m. for her third attempt at the Bendix Trophy. For this race, the pilots pushed higher into the atmosphere, above 20,000 feet. The high altitude forced them to use oxygen masks. Cochrane flew through the night to the Seversky engine's steady purr. As she crossed the Continental Divide, the engine sputtered and quit. Thinking she had run a fuel tank dry, she switched to another tank. That didn't help. She had plenty of fuel, but it wasn't getting to the engine. Cochrane kicked the rudder pedals back and forth, and the engine started again. The abrupt motion had unseated a blockage. After rocking the wings several times, she found that if she kept the left wing down, the engine kept running. It was a bit awkward, but it worked. She zipped across the country in just 8 hours and 10 minutes without stopping for fuel, besting 9 men for the win. After landing in Cleveland, she refueled, chatted with reporters for a few minutes, and greeted Odlum with, "I need some cigarettes. I've been smoking a pipe all the way from Burbank. An oxygen pipe." Newspapers, including the New York Times, splashed Cochrane's win across their front pages, coronating her as Queen of U.S. Aviation. Even then, some speculated that Cochrane hadn't flown the race, that it must have been a male pilot. In 1939, Cochrane outlined a plan to Eleanor Roosevelt to get U.S. women into the cockpits of military aircraft. If the U.S. joined the war raging in Europe, women pilots could free up men for combat tasks. The plan hadn't gone anywhere, but after ferrying the bomber in 1941, Cochrane observed women pilots ferrying aircraft around England. Maybe it was time to revive her idea. Arriving back in New York from her bomber flight, Cochrane planned to sleep until noon. But a call from President Franklin D. Roosevelt woke her at 9 a.m. Could she come to Hyde Park at noon? Over lunch, Cochrane regaled Roosevelt with tales about the women ferry pilots in England. She hoped American women could do the same thing. The lunch opened doors for meetings with high-ranking War Department officials, including Brigadier General Robert Olds, who was forming a unit to ferry aircraft. He was interested, but wanted to hire women on an individual basis, as civil servants or contractors. He would plug them in wherever needed. Cochrane had a much bigger vision, an organization just for women pilots, an organization she would run. She feared a handful of women scattered about the country among tens of thousands of men would simply go down as a flash in the historical pan. Cochrane's vision languished amid Army bureaucracy for 2 months. In mid-September, General H. Hap Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces, sent her a letter saying, "Not yet." He had a dozen excuses. There weren't enough qualified women pilots. There would be housing and training problems. Cochrane was ready with answers. Just as in England, the women could be in an auxiliary corps with military status separate from the men. Arnold wouldn't budge, but he encouraged Cochrane to take some women to England to fly as contractors with the British Air Transport Auxiliary. The experiment would prove that such an organization could work in the U.S. To reassure Cochrane that Brigadier General Olds would not hire women to ferry aircraft on his own terms while she was gone, Arnold said, "I'll keep Olds away from the women pilots." Cochrane had previously combed through Civil Aviation Authority files to come up with a list of potential women pilots for her planned organization. She sent telegrams to a few.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?